4 Gospels sit at the front of every New Testament printed in this country, and not one of them names its author anywhere inside the text. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Those names come from titles written at the top of the page by later hands, and the oldest complete copy of all 4 that survives, a Greek book from the middle of the 300s called Codex Sinaiticus, ends the Gospel of Mark at chapter 16, verse 8, with the women running away from an empty tomb, and nothing after that. No appearance. No Great Commission. The scribe drew his little decorative mark, wrote the closing title, and moved on to Luke. So here's what we're doing today, and it's 2 separate trails that most people hear about as one. First, how these 4 books were actually written, who was writing, when, in what order, using what, and how we can tell just by laying the pages side by side. Second, how these 4 got chosen out of a much larger pile, by whom, using what standards, and over how long. Those are different questions with different evidence, and the evidence is unusually good. We've got a Greek codex found in a monastery on Mount Sinai, a torn Latin list sitting in a library in Milan, a bishop's Easter letter from the year 367, a letter from a Syrian bishop who changed his mind about a book, and the texts themselves, which give away more than any of their authors intended. None of this is hidden. That's the first thing worth saying plainly. If you've got a New International Version at home, flip to the end of Mark and look at the bracket and the small print. The earliest manuscripts do not have Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. It's right there, printed in the Bible your grandmother gave you, sitting on a shelf in Tulsa or Grand Rapids or Charlotte. Somebody at the publishing house put it there on purpose. Most people's eyes slide right past it because a footnote in small gray type doesn't feel like it's talking to you. Today, it's going to talk to you. If that's the kind of thing you want more of. The actual paper trail, handled carefully, without anybody yelling. Subscribing helps this channel keep making it, and the like button is genuinely how these videos find the next curious person. Now, the guide for this one is Immanuel Kant, and he shows up later with a very specific idea about what a person owes their own mind when a book is involved. Hold that thought. Because before philosophy has anything useful to say, you need the evidence in your hands. Start with the strangest fact of all, the one that takes about 10 seconds to verify and about 10 years to stop thinking about. Read all 4 Gospels straight through in one sitting, which almost nobody does. Church reads them in fragments, a few verses on a Sunday, a chapter at Christmas. And you'll notice that 3 of them tell the story in nearly the same order, with nearly the same words, and the 4th one tells a different story entirely. Different opening, different timeline, different Jesus in the sense of how he talks, at what length, about what subject. That's not a scandal. That's data. And for about 250 years, scholars in Germany, England, and eventually here have been treating it as data, the way a geologist treats a rock face, as a record of how something got made. Begin with the names, because the names are the first thing people assume they know. In the Greek manuscripts, the titles read like this: Kata Markan, Kata Mataion, according to Mark, according to Matthew, not by, according to. And here's what makes that phrasing interesting. It's the phrasing you'd use for a version of a shared story, not a signature on a piece of work. Paul signs his letters in the first line. He tells you his name, tells you who he's writing to, sometimes tells you he's writing that part in his own big handwriting. The Gospels do nothing like that. Luke opens by addressing someone named Theophilus and mentioning that many others have already tried to write this account, and never says who he is. There's a real argument among historians about when those titles got attached. Martin Hengel, a German scholar who taught at Tübingen and was no radical, argued that the titles must be early and practical. The moment a congregation owned 2 of these scrolls, somebody had to be able to tell them apart, so you'd write the name on the outside the way you'd label anything in a library. Others, including Bart Ehrman at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, argue the attributions look like 2nd century assignments. The church settling on apostolic names for books that had circulated without them. What both sides agree on is the plain fact underneath. The names are not in the text. They're on the text. Our earliest surviving comment on who wrote these things comes from a man named Papias, a bishop in a town in what's now Western Turkey, writing maybe around the year 130. His own books are lost. We have him only because Eusebius, writing his church history around 325, quoted him, and Eusebius, worth saying, thought Papias wasn't very bright. Papias says he learned from an elder that Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote down accurately what he remembered, but not in order. Then he says Matthew arranged the sayings. The logia, which just means the sayings or oracles. In the Hebrew dialect, and everyone translated them as best they could. Sit with that second sentence, because it creates a problem that has never gone away. The Gospel of Matthew we have is Greek, not translated Greek, composed Greek. And it uses the Greek of Mark, phrase by phrase, as we're about to see. A book written in Hebrew or Aramaic and then translated wouldn't look like that. So either Papias is describing a different document that we no longer have, or he's passing along a tradition that had already drifted, or he means something by Hebrew dialect that scholars still argue about. Some suggest a Hebrew style of arrangement rather than a language. That is what the earliest evidence about gospel authorship actually looks like. A secondhand quotation of a man whose books are gone, preserved by a historian who found him unimpressive, describing books that don't quite match the description. If you grew up hearing that Matthew, the tax collector, wrote Matthew and John, the beloved disciple wrote John, nobody was lying to you. They were handing you a tradition that is genuinely ancient, traceable to the 2nd century, and handing it to you the way traditions get handed down, without the footnotes. That's how teaching works when you've got 40 minutes and a room full of 9-year-olds. The simplification isn't a conspiracy. It's a curriculum. Now the part where you can see it yourself, which is the whole reason this trail is worth walking. Put Matthew, Mark, and Luke in 3 columns. People have literally done this since the 1700s. The word for it is a synopsis, which just means seen together. Any decent study Bible in a church library has a version of it in the back, usually labeled a harmony of the Gospels, that little grid of parallel references nobody reads. What jumps out? Mark is the shortest, and almost everything in it turns up again in Matthew and Luke. Something like 90% of Mark's content shows up in Matthew. Not just the same events, the same Greek words, in the same order, including odd little phrases nobody would duplicate by accident. And here's the fingerprint that convinced most of the field. When Matthew rearranges Mark's order, Luke keeps it. When Luke rearranges, Matthew keeps it. They never both wander off in the same direction at the same time. That pattern is very hard to explain unless both of them are working from Mark, independently, each making his own edits. Then there's the direction of the changes, which is the part that makes people sit forward. Mark's Greek is rough, rushed. He connects everything with and then, like a man telling you a story he can't slow down. Matthew and Luke smooth it. Mark is also blunter about Jesus in ways the later two soften. In Mark chapter 6, at Nazareth, the text says he could do no mighty work there except lay hands on a few sick people. Matthew, telling the same scene in chapter 13, writes that he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Could not becomes did not. That's a small edit with a large idea inside it. Try another. In Mark chapter 10, a man runs up and calls Jesus, "Good teacher," and Jesus answers. The King James puts it, "Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is, God." Now open Matthew chapter 19 in the English Standard Version or the New International, both of which follow the older Greek manuscripts, and the question has become, why do you ask me about what is good? The awkwardness is gone. And notice the wrinkle. In the King James, Matthew reads just like Mark, because the King James was translated from later Greek copies where a scribe had already brought the two into line, so you can watch the smoothing happen twice. Once when Matthew wrote, and again centuries later in the copying. Here's the honest scholarly caveat, and it matters. Markan priority. The view that Mark came first is held by the large majority of New Testament scholars, but it isn't a law of physics. A minority, including defenders of what's called the Griesbach hypothesis, argue Matthew came first and Mark abbreviated. They have arguments. They lose the argument, in most departments, on the direction of editing evidence. But you should know the disagreement exists, because a field where nobody disagrees isn't a field, it's a catechism. And if the question of how the Bible got assembled in the first place has been sitting in the back of your mind through all of this, there's a video here on the channel called "The Bible Wasn't Written the Way You Were Taught," and it follows this exact trail through the Hebrew scriptures. Worth walking through after this one if you haven't sat with it yet. Which brings us to the material Matthew and Luke share that isn't in Mark at all. Roughly 235 verses of it. Almost entirely sayings. The Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, the passage about the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, the warning about serving 2 masters. Very little narrative. Barely any of the Passion story. And in stretches, the Greek matches word for word between Matthew and Luke. Not the gist. The vocabulary. 2 men in different cities, writing for different congregations, producing identical Greek sentences about ravens and storehouses. The standard explanation is a lost written document that both of them had. German scholars called it Quell, which is just the German word for source, and it got shortened to the letter Q. It's the most famous document in biblical studies that nobody has ever held. No copy, no fragment, no ancient writer mentions it by name. That last sentence is the crack, and a scholar named Mark Goodacre at Duke University drove a truck through it in a book called The Case Against Q, published in 2002. His alternative. It's usually called the Fairer theory, after the English scholar who developed it. Is simpler in one respect. Luke had Mark, and Luke also had Matthew. No hypothetical third document required. The people who defend Q, and John Kloppenborg at Toronto is the heavyweight there, answer that Luke's arrangement of the shared material makes no sense as an edit of Matthew, that Luke would have had to systematically dismantle Matthew's beautifully organized Sermon on the Mount and scatter it across 10 chapters for no discernible reason. Neither side has surrendered. Most scholars still work with Q. A serious minority thinks it's a ghost. And here's the thing worth noticing. We do know that collections of sayings without a storyline existed as a genre, because one turned up. In 1945, near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a farmer digging for fertilizer found a sealed jar with 13 leather-bound books inside, and one of them was the Gospel of Thomas. 114 sayings of Jesus, numbered, with no birth, no miracles, no crucifixion, no resurrection. Just sayings. So the format Q is supposed to have had is not something anybody invented to solve a puzzle. That format existed. And this is exactly where Immanuel Kant becomes useful, because he wrote one sentence in 1784 that describes the temptation sitting in front of you right now. He was answering a magazine's question about what enlightenment even means, and his diagnosis was that most people stay in what he called self-imposed immaturity. The German word means being a legal minor, someone still under a guardian's care. Then he explains why it's so comfortable. If I have a book that serves as my understanding, he says, and a pastor who serves as my conscience, and a doctor who decides my diet, I don't need to make any effort at all. A book that serves as my understanding. He wasn't even talking about the Bible specifically. But you can see why that line keeps coming back around in a discussion like this one. Kant's whole point was not that guides are worthless. It's that outsourcing your judgment permanently costs you something you can't get back any other way. John is a different animal, and every serious reader has always known it, including the ancient ones. Clement of Alexandria, writing around the year 200, said the others had set down the outward facts, and John wrote a spiritual gospel. That's a second-century man noticing the same thing you noticed the first time you read it. The differences aren't stylistic decoration. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus overturns the tables in the temple in the final week of his life, and it's the act that gets him killed. In John, that scene sits in chapter 2, at the very beginning. In the first 3, his public work looks like it lasts about a year, and he goes to Jerusalem once. In John, there are 3 Passovers, and he's back and forth constantly. In the first 3, he teaches in short sayings and parables. The mustard seed, the prodigal son. In John, there are no parables of that kind at all, and instead you get long, looping discourses and a string of sentences that don't appear anywhere else. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. And in the first 3, the crucifixion falls the day after the Passover meal. In John, it falls the day before, while the lambs are being killed in the temple. Historians read that last difference as theology carried by chronology. John is placing the death at the hour of the lambs on purpose, which raises the question people find genuinely unsettling at first and genuinely freeing later. These books were written to mean something, not just to record something. The authors were preachers before they were reporters. That's not a defect you have to explain away. It's the genre. As for when, the oldest physical scrap of any New Testament book is a credit card-sized piece of papyrus in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England, with a few lines of John chapter 18 on both sides. Pilate and Jesus, the trial. It's cataloged as Papyrus 52, and for decades it was dated around the year 125, which made it a very popular exhibit in apologetics. Brent Nongbrai, working on the paleography, has argued that the honest range is much wider, comfortably anywhere in the 2nd century, possibly later, because handwriting styles persisted for generations and you simply can't date a hand to within 25 years. Most scholars now cite it more cautiously. That's a small, clean example of a field correcting itself in public. Now hold the whole picture. 4 books. 1, earliest and roughest. 2, that used it and edited it and added a shared body of sayings. 1 that stands apart with its own timeline and its own voice. All 4 written in Greek. probably between the late 60s and the 90s of the first century, by educated men in cities, decades after the events, for communities that already had beliefs about what those events meant. Every one of those statements is arguable at the edges, and none of them is fringe. This is the ordinary content of a New Testament survey course at any state university in America. If somebody in your life keeps hearing rumors about this stuff and getting only the loud versions, either it's all fabricated or don't ask. Passing this along is a real kindness. A calm, sourced walk through the evidence is hard to find, and it's the only kind that actually helps. Now, the second trail. Not how they were written, how these four, and only these four, ended up bound together. And the surprise, when you follow it, is that the earliest identifiable fight about it wasn't over whether to add more books. It was over whether to keep this many. Around the year 144, in Rome, a shipowner from the Black Sea coast named Marcion, a wealthy man, a donor to the Roman congregation, got into an irreconcilable dispute with the leadership there and was expelled. His money was returned to him. And Marcion had a system. The God who made this world, the God of Genesis and the prophets, was not the Father Jesus revealed. Different God. Lower 1. So Marcion assembled a body of scripture that matched his theology, and as far as anyone can tell, it was the first Christian collection with a fixed table of contents. One gospel. A version of Luke, stripped of the birth story and other material he considered contaminated, plus 10 letters of Paul. That's it. No Hebrew scriptures at all. Tertullian, writing from North Africa around 207, attacked him at book length, and it's mostly through that attack that we know what Marcion's text contained, which is the standard, frustrating condition of this whole period. We read the losers through the writing of the winners. And there's live debate now about the direction of the editing, whether Marcion cut down our Luke, as Tertullian insisted, or whether he had an earlier, shorter version of Luke that later grew. Scholars, including Jason Badun and Matthias Klinghardt, have pressed that case. Plenty of others rejected. Unsettled. The point that survives the debate. Someone had to answer the question, which books? And by the middle of the 2nd century, the question was live enough that answering it wrongly got you thrown out of a congregation. Then came the opposite solution, and this one is my favorite, because it lived in your living room every December and you never knew. Around the year 170, a Syrian Christian named Tatian took all 4 Gospels and wove them into one continuous narrative. He called it the Diatessaron, Greek for through the 4. Every event in order, contradictions ironed out, duplicate scenes merged, one seamless life of Jesus. And it worked, spectacularly. For roughly 250 years, in the Syriac-speaking churches of the East, the Diatessaron was the Gospel, not a study aid. The text they read aloud in worship. Ephraim the Syrian wrote a commentary on it in the 4th century, and that commentary is a big part of how we reconstruct it, because no complete copy survives. It doesn't survive because it was eliminated. Theodoret, who became Bishop of Souris in Upper Syria in 423, reports that he personally gathered up more than 200 copies in use in the churches of his diocese and replaced them with the 4 separate Gospels. 200 copies, collected church by church. That's not a debate in a seminar room. That's a bishop with a cart. And here's where the American living room comes in. Go look at the nativity set on your mother's mantle. Shepherds on one side, wise men on the other, all of them kneeling at the same manger on the same night with the star overhead. That scene is not in the Bible, not in any single book of it. The shepherds and the angels and the manger are Luke. The Magi and the star and the flight into Egypt are Matthew. And in Matthew, they arrive at a house, and Herod's calculation of the age suggests it's well after the birth. Mark has no birth story at all. John opens before the creation of the world with the word, and never mentions Bethlehem. The nativity set is a harmony. Every Christmas pageant in every fellowship hall in America. Bathrobes, tinfoil halos, a 4th grader in a cardboard crown. Is a small, cheerful Diatessaron. Tatian's instinct is not some exotic ancient error. It's the most natural thing a religious mind does with 4 accounts. Braid them. American Christianity does it every December and calls it Christmas. So why did the braided version lose, officially, while the braiding instinct won, permanently, in practice? Part of the answer is Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon in Gaul, writing around the year 180 in a long work against various teachers he considered dangerous. In Book 3, Chapter 11, Section 8, he gives the earliest surviving argument for exactly 4 Gospels, And the argument goes like this. There are 4 zones of the world and 4 principal winds, so the church, spread over all the earth, must have 4 pillars. He adds the 4 living creatures around the throne in Ezekiel and Revelation, the man, the lion, the ox, the eagle, and matches them up. Now be honest about how that lands on modern ears. It isn't evidence. It's a symmetry argument. And that tells you something important. Irenaeus is not explaining how he chose 4. He's explaining why the 4 he already has makes sense. The number was a fact on the ground before he found a reason for it. These were the books his churches already read on Sunday and had for a generation or two. There's also a piece of plain technology in this story that gets overlooked. Christians were unusually early adopters of the Codex, the bound book with pages, while the rest of the Mediterranean world was still using scrolls. A scroll has a physical limit. You can fit 1 gospel on it, maybe. A codex can hold 4. TC. Skeet, a papyrologist at the British Museum, argued that the 4 gospel collection and the 4 gospel codex arrived together, that the binding itself helped fix the number. Whether or not you buy the full version of his case, the underlying point stands. The shape of the object shaped the canon. What you could physically bind together became what belonged together. That's the kind of detail that turns a doctrine back into history. Not a vote in a smoke-filled room. Church habit, plus an argument from symmetry, plus the carrying capacity of a stack of sewn pages. Then there's the letter from Antioch, and I think it's the single most human document in this entire investigation. Serapion was bishop of Antioch, in Syria, somewhere between about 190 and 211. He visited a congregation in a town called Rossus and found them reading a book called the Gospel of Peter. He hadn't read it. It had the name Peter on it, and these were good people, so he told them to go ahead. Then somebody told him what was actually in it, so he got a copy, read it carefully, and wrote the church a letter reversing himself. Eusebius preserves a chunk of it in Book 6, Chapter 12 of his history. Serapion says he accepts Peter and the other apostles as he accepts Christ, but that writings falsely bearing their names he rejects, having learned from experience, and he identifies the specific problem. The book leaned toward what's called docetism, the teaching that Jesus only appeared to be physical and only appeared to suffer. In the fragment of the Gospel of Peter that French archaeologists dug up at Akhmim in Egypt in the winter of 1886, there's a line describing Jesus on the cross as silent, as though he felt no pain. Watch what Serapion actually did, because this is a method, not a mood. He accepted a book on the strength of a name. Then he examined it. Then he changed his position based on the contents. Then he explained his reasoning to the people affected in writing so they could evaluate it themselves. That is the closest thing we have to a canon criterion in action, and it wasn't a rule handed down from anywhere. It was one man reading, comparing, and deciding, using standards that were widely shared but never codified. Is it connected to the apostolic generation? Does it fit what the churches already teach? Is it actually being used in worship across the wider church? And now Kant's line about the book that serves as your understanding lands differently, doesn't it? Because the people who assembled the New Testament were not doing what the popular picture suggests, receiving a finished object and passing it along untouched. They were reading critically, comparing, rejecting things with apostolic names on the cover. Serapion, in the 2nd century, in a Syrian town, did exactly what your instinct told you to do when you first noticed that Matthew and Luke tell different Christmas stories. Kant's argument was never that examination is disrespect. It's that a person who has never examined what they believe doesn't yet own it. They're holding it for someone else. And by that standard, the bishops of the 2nd century were considerably more grown up than the version of church history most Americans were handed in a felt-board classroom. If that reframing does something for you, if a piece of this just clicked into place, the like button is what carries it to the next person who's been sitting on these questions and assuming they were the only one. Skip ahead a century and a quarter to a scholar with access to the best Christian library in the world. Eusebius of Caesarea, writing around the year 325 in a city on the coast of Palestine, had inherited the Library of Origen, and he sat down to sort out which Christian writings the churches actually accepted. He didn't produce a list. He produced categories in Book 3, Chapter 25 of his church history, and the categories are the tell. Recognized: the 4 Gospels, Acts, the letters of Paul, 1 John, 1 Peter. Disputed but familiar to most: James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John. Spurious: the Acts of Paul, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Didache, which is a short manual of church practice. And a fourth pile, forgeries put out under apostolic names by people he considered heretics, including the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Matthias. Revelation he can't place. He lists it twice, once as recognized and once as questionable, and says people disagree about it, which is a strikingly honest thing for a historian to do. Read that carefully and you'll notice. Nearly 300 years after Jesus, the four Gospels are locked in and nobody's arguing. The edges are still soft. The argument at that point was about James and Jude and Revelation, not about Matthew and Mark. Now the torn document, because you'll hear it cited constantly and it deserves a straight explanation. In 1740, an Italian scholar named Ludovico Antonio Muratori published 85 lines of bad Latin he'd found in a 7th or 8th century manuscript from the monastery at Bobbio, now in the Ambrosian Library in Milan. It's the oldest known list of New Testament books. The beginning is missing, so it opens mid-sentence about the third Gospel, Luke, and then John. What makes it interesting is the reasoning it shows, not the list. It accepts the wisdom of Solomon. It accepts the apocalypse of Peter, but adds that some among us won't allow it to be read in church. And it rejects the Shepherd of Hermas on a specifically historical ground. It was written recently, in our own times, and so it can be read privately, but not read publicly as scripture. That's a decision about date, made in public, with a reason attached. The dating fight over this fragment is a good lesson in itself. The traditional date is around 170 to 200, based on that line about Hermas writing recently. In 1968, Albert Sundberg argued it belongs in the 4th century and in the East, and Geoffrey Hahneman developed the case at book length in 1992. Charles Hill, Joseph Verheyden, and Christoph Gignard have pushed back hard for the early Roman date, and most scholars have landed back there. But not all, and the argument is technical and ongoing. You are allowed to hold a question open. That's not weakness. And it isn't fence-sitting. Holding a question open with the evidence on the table is a skill, and it's rarer than certainty in either direction. The list you actually use. All 27 books, no more, no fewer, shows up for the first time in a surviving document in the year 367. Not from a council, from a letter. Every year, the Bishop of Alexandria wrote to the churches under him, announcing the date of Easter, and those letters usually included pastoral instruction. Athanasius had been in and out of exile 5 times over the Arian controversy, and in his 39th festal letter he listed the books of the Old and New Testaments, gave the 27 we have, and said let no one add to them and let nothing be taken from them. He also mentions, separately, books he considers useful for instructing new converts. The Shepherd is in that second group, alongside the Didache. Not scripture. Not garbage. Good reading. And notice what's absent from this story. No ecumenical council ever voted on the New Testament canon. The Council of Nicaea, in 325, did not. Nicaea was about how to describe the relationship between the Father and the Son, and the canon isn't in its documents. That story about books being tossed on a table and the inspired ones jumping up comes from a much later legend, and the Da Vinci Code version of Constantine picking Gospels is not something any historian defends. Regional synods at Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397 ratified a list, which is a different thing from creating one. They were confirming a settlement that congregational use had already made, over roughly 3 centuries. Now come back to the book we started with, because it's the physical proof of everything just described. Codex Sinaiticus was copied in the middle of the 300s, within a generation of Athanasius's letter. Constantine von Tischendorf found leaves of it at St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai in 1844 and the bulk of it in 1859, and how he got it out of there is a dispute the monastery has never dropped. 4 columns of Greek to a page, written by at least 3 scribes, with corrections added by later hands over the following centuries. You can see them, because the whole thing has been digitized and put online for free, page by page, and bound into it, at the end of the New Testament, after Revelation, the Epistle of Barnabas, complete, and the Shepherd of Hermas. Sit with that. Somebody in the middle of the 4th century, commissioning the most expensive Bible money could buy, parchment from hundreds of animals, professional scribes, included 2 books that are not in yours. The same 2 books Athanasius was, in that same span of years, sorting into the helpful but not scripture pile. The line hadn't finished hardening. You can put your finger on the exact page where it was still soft. That's also where Mark stops at chapter 16, verse 8, in Greek, on the word afraid. Literally on a small Greek connecting word, which is why the ending sounds so abrupt in the original. And Codex Vaticanus, The other great 4th century Bible does the same thing and leaves the rest of the column empty, as though the scribe knew something was supposed to be there and had nothing to write. Step back and look at the whole shape, because the shape is the real finding. 4 books get written between roughly the late 60s and the 90s of the 1st century by anonymous authors, one of them working from oral tradition and the others working from him, plus shared sayings material, plus their own sources. Names get attached in the 2nd century. Congregations start collecting them, and the bound codex makes a 4-in-1 volume physically possible. A man in Rome proposes cutting the collection to 1. A man in Syria proposes fusing 4 into 1. Churches across the Mediterranean, without any central authority to consult, end up keeping 4. Bishops test disputed books against apostolic connection and doctrinal fit and write down their reasoning. A scholar in Palestine sorts the whole library into piles and admits which piles are contested. A bishop in Egypt writes a list in a letter about Easter. Councils ratify. Scribes keep copying, and their corrections and additions ride along inside the text, which is how the last 12 verses of Mark and the woman caught in adultery, a story that isn't in Sinaiticus either, became parts of the Bible that millions of people can quote. Not one step in that chain requires anybody to be lying. Every step requires people to be doing what people do with texts they love. Use them, copy them, compare them, argue about them, and eventually draw a line and defend it. And this pattern is not a Christian peculiarity. That's the part that should widen the frame rather than narrow it. The Hebrew scriptures went through their own long sorting, with debates recorded in the Talmud about whether Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs belonged. The Quran was gathered into a standard written edition under the Caliph Uthman, and the traditional accounts themselves describe variant collections that had to be dealt with. Buddhist councils argued over what belonged in the Pali Canon. Every tradition that has a book has a story about how the book got that way, and in every case, the story involves human beings making decisions and writing down why. Which is where Kant finally pays off, and it's not the payoff people expect from a philosopher in a video like this. Kant spent the last decade of his life arguing, against real professional risk, that the faculty of philosophy in a university must be free to examine everything the faculties of theology, law, and medicine teach. He published the argument in 1798 in a book about the conflict between those faculties. His reasoning was not that theology is false. It's that a teaching which can't survive open examination is not actually doing the work it claims to do. And in his book on religion, 5 years earlier, he made the move that matters most here. The value of a sacred text, for him, sits in what it does to a person's moral life, in whether reading it makes you more honest, more just, less willing to treat another human being as a tool. That value doesn't evaporate when you learn who copied what from whom. It was never resting on that in the first place. So when you learn that Matthew edited Mark, nothing morally serious in the Sermon on the Mount changes. The instruction to love your enemy doesn't get weaker because you now know which document it traveled in. Here's what usually lifts for people who go through this. The weight that comes off isn't belief. It's the exhausting job of defending a claim nobody ever asked these books to make about themselves. If you were taught that the Gospels are 4 independent eyewitness accounts that agree in every particular, then every difference you notice, and you will keep noticing them because they're on the page, becomes a small crisis you have to manage. You end up building elaborate explanations for why the rooster crowed a different number of times. That is a heavy, thankless job. And it was assigned to you by a teaching model, not by the texts. The curiosity that got you this far is not a defect. The kid who raised his hand in Sunday school to ask why the wise men are in the pageant when Mark doesn't mention them was doing history, correctly, at 9 years old. The person who quietly read the footnote about Mark's ending and felt their stomach drop was reading carefully, which is the only way anybody should read anything that matters. And if you've been carrying a suspicion for years that you were only ever given the sanded down version, you were right. And being right about that is not a betrayal of anybody. It's what Kant meant when he said the courage part is the hard part. Not the intelligence, the nerve. There's more of this trail in both directions, and if the Hebrew scriptures are the next thing you want opened up the same way, the Bible wasn't written the way you were taught is the one on this channel that does it. It's a good next hour if you haven't watched it yet. Subscribing keeps these coming, since there's plenty of ground left. And if somebody in your life has been asking these questions alone, send this to them. Then tell me one thing in the comments. What's the first difference between the Gospels you noticed on your own, before anybody told you it was there? Before you had a word for it? And what did you do with it at the time? 4 men wrote, hundreds copied, dozens argued, and every one of them expected you to read it with your eyes open. That was never the part you had to be protected from.